You might be aware that the US draft for the Vietnam War didn't target everyone in the US fairly. Those with influence or connections could either avoid it entirely or put themselves in positions far away from the brutal fighting in the tropical jungles of the communist nation. That's not very surprising. Power and influence have swayed people and decisions throughout history. What is surprising, though, is that some people seem to be disproportionately targeted by the draft. Before we get into the draft, let's have a quick look at how and why this conflict started by wandering through the streets of modern-day Vietnam. Bullet holes pockmark the walls of the palace. In the sky above, birds chirp, blissfully unaware. Walking through the Hue Imperial City in Vietnam today, you can't help but feel the heaviness of the country's history. At the height of the Nguyen dynasty, Hue had been the capital city for over 100 years. Within the walls of the historical city are palaces that once were homes to the imperial family. As you walk along the walls of the once ornate city, past gardens and shrines, you can imagine people sitting in the sun, smiling. But as you look closer at the walls that you're walking past, you can't help but see the bullet holes, hundreds, thousands of them. You can trace the lines of automatic machine guns sweeping from right to left wildly. UNESCO declared the city a World Heritage Site in 1993 because of its profound history and the stark symbolism that it provides for the Vietnam War. 8,500 miles away, the United States of America does not have any physical bullet holes to point to from the war. There were no World Heritage Sites or historic battlegrounds from the Vietnam War. The country was not torn apart in an ideological war inflamed by international superpowers. Their home was not bathed in liquid fire that clung to their skin. For many, the conflict is a distant memory or something to sit through in history class. But for those who fought, those who were there, those same bullet holes are present throughout their lives. And for one group of U.S. soldiers, there are disproportionate rates of trauma, poverty, injury, homelessness, and death. One group of soldiers whose country truly failed them, who were shipped off to a war they should have never been allowed to see. The men who served under Project 100,000. What the West calls the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese call the American War, or to give it its full title, the war against the Americans to save the nation. The conflict was raging before U.S. troops set foot on Vietnamese soil and continued after their eventual withdrawal. It was the second of the Indochina Wars and one of the largest proxy wars to take place as part of the Cold War. Still with us? Let's define all those things a little bit better with some of the backstory of the region. It all started with the French Jesuit missionaries arriving in the 17th century, looking to spread Catholicism to all corners of the world. The French found surprising success in Vietnam. Their influence grew steadily over the next couple hundred years, spurring trade and diplomatic relations between France and Vietnam. It wasn't just modern-day Vietnam, though. The region known as Indochina also comprised Cambodia, Laos, the Chinese territory of Guangzhou, and the Vietnamese regions of Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochin China in the south. The region turned against the Catholics over time and started to persecute and expel the missionaries from its shores. France used this as an opportunity to invade and annex Indochina in 1858. It was a long, drawn-out conflict that ended 4 years later in 1862 with the signing of the Treaty of Saigon. Catholicism was legalized again, and the French proceeded to take more and more land over the course of the next few decades until they had control of all the regions we listed earlier. But the French stronghold could only last so long. 100 years later, and on the other side of the world, Nazi Germany invaded France and took control of the nation in just 6 weeks. The war was also raging in Asia, and Japan successfully invaded and took Indochina away from the French. This conflict was even shorter, lasting just 4 days from the 22nd of September 1940 to the 26th. The French remained there but were under the control of the Japanese, who used the region as a key strategic launching point for their military against China. This period saw waves of death sweeping through the country. Poor organization from the French officials and a number of natural disasters led to severe famines that are estimated to have killed up to 1 million Vietnamese between 1944 and 1945. The scales of power looked to be in danger of tipping back quickly, though, as France was liberated from Germany in 1945 and the Nazis were in full retreat in Europe. Japan acted swiftly, ousting the remaining French from the country and establishing Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as independent states within Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This again was a dark period in Vietnamese history. More Vietnamese women were forced to become so-called comfort women for the Japanese soldiers in the region. This was true all across Asia, with comfort women stations also in China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, North Korea, and South Korea. The Japanese took Vietnamese rice in enormous quantities, refusing to pay for any of it. Along the Red River Delta in the north of Vietnam, this directly led to the starvation and deaths of between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese. This death and destruction was the birthplace of Vietnamese resistance. A revolutionary known as Ho Chi Minh rose up and formed a League for the Independence of Vietnam, also known as the Viet Minh. Japan's stranglehold on Asia did not last. With their defeat in World War II, they left Vietnam, giving Ho Chi Minh the opportunity to take control of the north of the country for himself. He idealized the communist policies of China and the Soviet Union and wanted to model his country based on their examples. He established Hanoi as the capital of his new Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But he had a problem. Japan had left the south of the country in the hands of Emperor Bao Dai. Bao Dai had been educated by the French and was looking to model the south of the country on Western values and philosophies. France backed Bao and gave him the means to establish Saigon as his capital. Years of fighting ensued, with the border never really established between the two forces as they pushed back and forth in a bid to take over the whole nation and establish a unified Vietnam under their political ideology. The Geneva Conference in 1954 promised a short-lived hope for respite as the two sides agreed to divide their country along the 17th parallel, named after the latitude line it followed. They agreed to have a vote in 1956 about reunification to sort the conflict once and for all. But before they reached that point, history for Vietnam took a turn for the worse yet again. In the South, an election was called. Should the country remain a monarchy with Emperor Bao Dai in charge, or should it become a republic under a president? The results? 98.9% voted in favor of changing to a republic. Supposedly, it's practically unheard of to see election results skewed that strongly in one direction without blatant corruption and fraud. Trying to get millions of people to agree on anything is virtually impossible, especially when it comes to politics. To illustrate this, in Saigon, the Republicans received more than 600,000 votes. Pretty impressive, especially when you consider the fact that Saigon only had 450,000 on its electoral roll. The stage was set for a new ruling body in the south, one led by Ngo Dinh Siem. He took the presidency in the newly Republic of Vietnam, not to be confused with the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the north. Things were rapidly shifting on the global stage, too. Tensions between the US and the Soviets were heating up as the Cold War rumbled to life. The US felt it needed to strengthen its position where it could, so President Eisenhower announced his firm support of Siem's government in 1955. He started to ship CIA operatives into South Vietnam to help quash any latent supporters of the North's communist regime that were still in the area. These Americans trained and equipped the South Vietnamese forces to fight against the communists. Eisenhower labeled the communists as the Viet Cong, or the Vietnamese Communists, and over the course of 2 years, his U.S. operatives trained southern Vietnamese forces to capture, torture, and murder over 100,000 of these people. It was the enforcement of ideology by force. These were the kinds of actions that the U.S. population could not dream of happening on their own soil, but enjoyed blissful ignorance of as it occurred on the other side of the world. But as history has demonstrated already, you can only oppress a group so much before they start to fight back. Fueled by anger, a resistance against Siem's regime was forming. And it wasn't just the Viet Cong. They also recruited a number of people disenfranchised and angry with his leadership. By 1959, these rebels had started to attack the South Vietnamese army directly, engaging them in targeted strikes and guerrilla warfare. A year later, they formed the National Liberation Front, the NLF, something which spooked the U.S. government. As John F. Kennedy came into office, there was a lot of talk about a supposed domino theory. A lot of countries in Asia were teetering on the verge of communism. Kennedy believed that if one of these countries fell into Soviet control, it would cascade throughout the whole region, making Asia a stronghold for the communist regime and weakening the U.S.'s global influence significantly. They couldn't let this happen, and things only got more tense the following couple of years. A coup in South Vietnam caught Siem off guard, and he was killed by a resistance group backed by the CIA. Soon after, Kennedy was assassinated in the U.S. Both countries, already in precarious positions, were suddenly under new leadership. Lyndon B. Johnson took on the U.S. presidency and took decisive action. He would drastically increase economic and military support in South Vietnam to rid them of the communist threat once and for all. Planes, attack boats, and weapons all steadily started to stream across the ocean. But there was one key promise that Johnson made. He would not put U.S. troops on Vietnamese soil. There was an election coming up, and he didn't want to lose votes after all. In 1964, a North Vietnamese boat fired at a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was all Johnson needed. He took the event to Congress and managed to persuade them to grant him greater military powers without having to officially declare war. He launched aerial bombing runs, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. was walking a tightrope with this one. They didn't set many clear objectives for Operation Rolling Thunder, but instead designed it to be a display of might and intent. They wanted to intimidate and force back Ho Chi Minh's communist forces and boost South Vietnamese morale with their impressive firepower. But they didn't want to attack too hard or do too much damage. If North Vietnam looked close to collapse, they would run the risk of China or the USSR stepping in which could be a catalyst for another world war and then quickly escalate to the launch of nuclear warheads. Did it work? No. The Viet Cong did not relent. They continued to appear everywhere, fighting with greater resolve than before. The US and South Vietnam were making little progress, so in March 1965, with the support of the American people, Johnson broke his promise and sent US troops to Vietnam. The initial force that arrived there totaled around 190,000 personnel. The following year, he sent across a further 400,000. What ensued was a long and harrowing war littered with war crimes, chemical weapons, propaganda, and countless casualties, which begs the question, where was the US getting all of its troops? The United States military, throughout 6 different wars, had used what was called a draft system. They required all men over the age of 18 to register for the selective service. In times of war, when they need to bolster troop numbers, the US government will send out letters to these men telling them to enlist in the military unless they have a reasonable exemption. Throughout the years, these exemptions have been things like having wives and children, which led to a huge surge of young Americans rushing to the altar at the outbreak of the Vietnam War. Draft evasion was widespread. While the American public at that stage was not strongly opposed to the Vietnam War, many had no desire to go over and fight themselves. To jump ahead of the curve, a lot of young men enrolled in branches that would not see any combat. The Coast Guard, for example, saw a huge boom in volunteers early on. This came back to bite them as over 15,000 of the Coast Guard ended up being sent to Vietnam by the end of the war anyway. Between 60,000 and 100,000 men fled to Canada or Sweden to avoid being called up for service. For others, college education meant they could be given more senior positions or technical roles away from the front line. This led to a poverty line in the U.S. forces, as the frontline soldiers were on average poorer and less educated. This applied double to the rich and famous, who had a good deal of influence over where they could be stationed. Some of the high-profile celebrities who dodged the draft were Ted Nugent, who took drugs and urinated on himself before his physical examination to purposefully fail, and Chevy Chase, who has admitted that he lied to his interviewers about experiencing homosexual urges, which precluded men from joining the military at the time. The biggest way that most people avoided the draft, however, was by failing the medical. There were certain basic health requirements that draftees needed to meet in order to serve in the armed forces, and not before long the American public had found all the loopholes. Defective feet are a particularly famous one, recently brought back into the public discourse, as that was Donald Trump's excuse for not serving. Buried in the medical exam was one category in particular, one that was designed to protect vulnerable people from being shipped off to war: the IQ test. Following the Second World War, a threshold had been added to the criteria for fit-enabled soldiers. They needed to have an IQ above 80. Below that, people were often on the borderline of having mental disabilities. In a war zone, this would put them at significantly higher risk than their peers. They might suffer from impaired decision-making, slower reaction times, and difficulty processing complex tasks quickly. There was a reason that threshold existed. But in 1966, the Vietnam War looked set to drag on, with potentially hundreds of thousands of soldiers being shipped across year after year. Lyndon B. Johnson was looking for fresh ideas to bolster his numbers. That was when his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara proposed Project 100,000. The plan was simple. They would lower the IQ threshold and loosen the rules around physical conditions. It would open up the draft to hundreds of thousands of new Americans who could fill up the basic frontline roles that the rest of the country were doing their best to avoid. It was McNamara's belief that he could raise these men's intelligence by training them up for war. He was a big proponent of advanced technology and saw the potential of videotapes as an educational tool. He thought that by playing a number of educational tapes to these low IQ soldiers, it could result in their intelligence being bolstered. It slotted in perfectly to Johnson's domestic policy as well. He declared a war on poverty. It was his goal to raise the education and living standards of the poorest and most disadvantaged Americans during his time in office. A big way of boosting these stats was getting the poor into work. This was a surefire way to get that done. People with low intelligence who were struggling to get into the workforce would be employed by the military, trained up on a new set of skills during their service, and returned to America as productive members of society. He put his plan into action, forming the New Standards Men. These soldiers were kept anonymous and distributed throughout all branches of the armed forces to pad out the numbers. They'd all scored in Category 4 of the military tests, meaning they'd scored between 10% and 30%. Soldiers with scores as low as 10% were now being shipped to Vietnam. A new nickname for the new standards men quickly spread through the ranks. They were looked down upon and scorned with the name Moron Corps. Not only were mentally disabled soldiers recruited through this program, but soldiers with physical disabilities too, and yet they received no special training. They were put through the exact same basic training as every other recruit, and no additional support was provided. It's still not known how many soldiers were sent to Vietnam through this program, but it's estimated between 320,000 and 354,000 men. The Army received the lion's share of these recruits, getting over 70% of them. There were low-skilled positions readily available in the Army, and due to experiencing the highest mortality rate of all the armed forces branches in Vietnam, they needed the extra numbers on the front line. And the front line for Vietnam was about as horrific as any in history. The U.S. designated areas known as free fire zones. In these places, supposedly all civilians had been given ample time and notice to evacuate, so the only people remaining there would be Viet Cong militants. They could be shot on sight. Perhaps the thing that characterized the Vietnam War the most horrifically was the use of napalm. The company Dow Chemical, makers of Saran wrap, had created a jellified flammable mixture. Burning at 2,000 degrees and fiercely sticky, napalm was frequently described as liquid fire. Launched from turrets on boats, unleashed from bomber aircraft overhead, and fired from handheld flamethrowers on land, it was seen as the perfect weapon for the dense Vietnamese jungle. It would cling to surfaces and flow in all directions. It was much more difficult to extinguish than regular fire and released large amounts of carbon monoxide, a poisonous gas that would knock out or kill combatants who somehow managed to avoid the inferno. Worst of all, it clung to your skin. If you tried to wipe it off, you'd only spread it. In your panic, you could make it worse. These free fire zones did not only have enemy combatants in them, 388,000 tons of napalm were dropped on Vietnam across the war. A single napalm airstrike would light 2,500 square feet on fire with no chance of it being put out. These were low-accuracy attacks, often performed over villages. Innocent civilians, including children, were constantly killed or permanently disfigured by the napalm attacks. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It was hell on earth. The U.S. strategy in the war was not primarily to take ground, advance a front line, or capture key strategic areas. The goal was attrition. Kill as many enemy troops as possible and don't worry too much about taking new territory. The word bloodbath is so often used that we've grown numb to its imagery, but take a moment to think about what it really means. Bloodbath. That was Vietnam. The North Vietnamese forces fought back with ferocity. The inhumanity of the U.S. forces only seemed to spur on a greater fighting spirit within them. They used the land to their advantage, launching devastating ambushes and trapping U.S. troops. Despite all their superior firepower, the U.S. Army had critically underestimated their foe and waded into a land they didn't know at all. The Viet Cong were able to retake land easily due to the U.S. strategy of attrition and were receiving a steady supply from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a historic trade route that snaked its way out of Vietnam and into Cambodia and Laos. In response, the U.S. launched a secret war against Laos, where they routinely bombed the trail in an attempt to stop the Viet Cong supply. The war dragged on, and steadily public sentiment grew hostile in the U.S. By 1967, over 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam, 15,000 dead, and a further 100,000 injured. U.S. citizens were questioning the point of the war. They were losing loved ones at an alarming rate. For what purpose? Most of them had no real connection to Vietnam at all. Why should they be fighting there in the first place? A wave of peace protests erupted across the U.S., tied to the countercultural movements already going on in the 60s. In 1968, Hanoi launched a counteroffensive against the U.S. forces, which caught them off guard. While they were able to deal with this, the U.S. military's request for a further 200,000 troops to be deployed following the attack was not well received in the U.S. at all, and Johnson soon lost the presidency to Richard Nixon. The end of the war was supposedly imminent. But what followed was several more years of bitter disagreement in the U.S. as to what they should do, as in Vietnam thousands upon thousands were dying. Young people on college campuses up and down the country were protesting hard, but older generations branded them as unpatriotic and treasonous. Nixon decided to roll back some of the U.S. troops in favor of a mostly aerial assault and what he called Vietnamization. Word reached the U.S. of the My Lai massacre. A village of 400 civilians had been slaughtered by U.S. troops. And still, the war rumbled on. In 1970, the U.S. and South Vietnam invaded Cambodia and Laos in breach of international law. Another wave of protests, even more incensed than before, broke out across the U.S. At Kent State University in Ohio, 4 students were shot dead. At Jackson State University in Mississippi, another 2 were killed. Another 2 years of fighting followed that. North Vietnam drafted a peace deal, but Saigon in the south rejected it. Nixon authorized a fresh wave of aerial bombings north of the border, known as the Christmas bombings. Still more bloodshed. It was only in January 1973 that a peace deal was agreed upon between the US and North Vietnam, but that still didn't stop the fighting. Only once Saigon was captured by the North Vietnamese forces and renamed Ho Chi Minh City did the conflict eventually come to an end. Vietnam became a communist nation. The US had failed. 20 years of war had left Vietnam scarred almost beyond recognition. 2 million Vietnamese had been killed, a further 3 million were wounded, and then 12 million on top of that had become refugees. Napalm scorched the jungles. Entire villages were razed to the ground. Exhausted, traumatized, disenfranchised, the US troops returned home. 58,200 of them had died. The rest were scorned by both sides of the protests. The anti-war side saw them as war criminals, and the pro-war side saw them as an army that had failed to win against a smaller, weaker communist country. Many of the soldiers had deserted or refused to fight toward the end and were branded as cowards on their return home. Long-term exposure to herbicides like Agent Orange that had been dumped in copious amounts on the Vietnam landscape left permanent and serious health consequences. More than 300,000 of them were wounded, with many losing limbs. These soldiers were returning home with unprecedented rates of PTSD. The US military had made use of psychoactive drugs commonplace during the war, handing out amphetamines to soldiers regularly with little regulation. It was supposed to heighten their responses and give them the alertness needed for long-range reconnaissance missions. But what it had actually done was create a frenzied storm in many of the soldiers' minds. Not only were they witnessing the widespread use of napalm on innocent civilians before their very eyes, but they were seeing that while dosed up on powerful psychoactive stimulants. Every sight, every sound was heightened to the extreme. They couldn't sleep. Returning home, these soldiers struggled to process what they had witnessed. They weren't sure what was real, what was a nightmare, and what was from the drugs. Their own memories of the events lied to them. Many simply couldn't cope. Post-war support for these veterans was inadequate, to say the least. But there was one group of soldiers affected more harshly than any others. Of course, we're talking about those recruited through Robert McNamara's Project 100,000. The true extent of the damage done to the lives of these men was only made apparent years after the end of the war. In 2015, Gregory Hamilton estimated that members of the so-called Moron Corps died at 3 times the rate of the average US soldier in Vietnam. Remember the promises that Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert McNamara had made? This would be an opportunity for these men. They would learn through military training, raising their intelligence level. They would gain relevant skills and experience through their service that would help them gain employment on the other side. Together, they would end the war on poverty. McNamara gave this speech at the dawn of the program. What these men badly need is a sense of personal achievement, a sense of succeeding at some task, a sense of their own intrinsic potential. They've grown up in an atmosphere of drift and discouragement. It is not simply the sometimes squalid ghettos of their external environment that has debilitated them, but an internal and more destructive ghetto of personal disillusionment and despair, a ghetto of the human spirit. In contrast, after the end of the war, the Department of Defense published these findings, comparing the lives of Project 100,000's veterans to non-veterans in the same bracket. Comparisons between Project 100,000 participants and their non-veteran peers showed that in terms of employment status, educational achievement, and income, non-veterans appeared better off. Veterans were more likely to be unemployed and to have a significantly lower level of education. Income differences ranged from $5,000 to $7,000 in favor of non-veterans. Veterans were more likely to have been divorced. The traumas of war had ruined the lives of countless American troops. High IQ soldiers were struggling to make sense of what they had seen and done. How much worse had those mental scars been for those with disabilities? This is exactly why IQ thresholds and physical requirements existed in the soldiers' tests, to protect those who would face significantly higher risks in the military. In 1995, Myra McPherson published a review questioning the political motivations behind the decision to launch Project 100,000. The reason enlistment was low was because privileged middle and upper-class citizens were doing all in their power to avoid the draft. Rather than closing the loopholes, making college-educated men serve in lower ranks, and preventing the rich and famous from escaping the war, the US government decided to plug the gaps with the most disadvantaged members of society. In 2006, the New York Times branded it as a failed experiment. It provided to be a distraction for the military and of little benefit to the men it was created to help. All of that bloodshed and pain and trauma for a failed experiment. Now check out why American soldiers killed their own officers in Vietnam War, or watch this video instead.